Like it's customary in Australia, I just want to acknowledge our elders and elders across the globe and the different countries. I pay my respect to them and want to say thank you for the opportunity to be part of this session and giving us the opportunity to learn. Um, Today's conversation is going to be around reimagining authentic assessments, looking at best practices for design, and also how can we measure authentic assessments. We've been introduced, we're going to be looking at five to six questions, and hopefully, if we've got time, we're going to respond to two questions from the audience. And the format for this session is that I'll pose a question. The first question goes to all the panelists, and subsequent questions will go to one or two of the panelists. And as time permits, we're going to take a few questions from the audience, like I said. Now, the very first question for me is around how we define authentic assessment. And for me, one of the biggest definitions that has left an impact in me is an authentic assessment is an assessment requiring students to use the same competencies or combinations of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that they need to apply in the criterion situation in professional life. So my very first question goes to all the four panelists, and the question goes, what makes for an authentic assessment? I'll start with Kevin.
Thanks, Chooks. When I think of authentic assessment, some of the characteristics that come to mind for me are that it should really draw upon theory to inform practice, and where possible, partners with industry to solve real-world problems, such as those linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. For us, it needs to align, or it's wise to align with our school's research interests to optimize resources. Again, for us, aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals makes sense. It provides professionally relevant artifacts for students. It aligns weekly activities to artifacts that inform their assessments. It needs to very clearly align rubrics to the assessment guide, so there's clarity around it. Provides feedback and feed-forward opportunities that inspires students to extend themselves to achieve desired outcomes. And, where possible, includes feedback from our industry partners. So, and an example of an assessment that I've been able to transform was in marketing class that I take with the executive MBA and MBA programs. We had a case that was a written case, and we were using that. Certainly when I came to the school, that was the format. And I decided I'd network and align with industry and bring industry in to create something that's more current and hopefully got some greater impact for students. So what we did is, or what I decided to do around the design was work with the industry partner, make sure that the project was aligned with social, environmental, or economic opportunities linked to our research interests. Reason there being, we need to optimize our own resources within the organization. In the past, had experienced trying to do teaching and learning and trying to do research and juggle the two. If you combine the two, I think you get an optimum outcome and you get maximum buy-in from academics. I pre-record a webinar to get the resources around the project and a project brief. And the assignments are basically an individual research component that informs the second group assignment, which is then around ideation and developing a solution to the problem, which is pitched to the industry partner. They have an opportunity for feedback from the industry partner, and then we take the fundamental learnings, the soft and hard skills they've learned throughout, and apply them to themselves in what was a reflection initially, just a reflection on the experience and some of the theoretical learnings, was taken to then be, in this case, a personal branding action plan, so that it's very attributable. And we've had feedback from students who've used this successfully in their career advancement. So ideal outcomes are when students report meaningful personal and professional outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Liz, what's your definition of, or what makes for an authentic assessment?
Hi, Chooks. Thanks for inviting me. I think that Kevin has conceptualized it really well. And I do agree that it has to do with, basing it in a realistic context. It has to actually be focused on promoting those higher order thinking abilities that are so popular. The apply, the analyze, the synthesize, the evaluation of different topics, and that the outcome needs to be genuine and a worthwhile product. So conceptualizing authentic assessment, I don't think it's a real issue. I think in my experience, the real issue is in the application of that assessment. And in my experience, it has to do with how, with the nature of, and with the nature and context of higher education. So there were a couple of studies done in 2013 that suggested that, at least in Australia, more than half of university teaching was done by subject matter experts, so sessional staff. And often because they were sessional, they were hired based on their subject matter expertise, and there was little focus on their pedagogical preparation. So what I found, and also through my research, is that these are people who are highly capable, but may or may not know how to teach. So as a learning specialist, the challenge in here is that I found a phenomenon that when people that are highly competent are challenged with teaching, they revert back to how they were taught. And now you can imagine that if you were growing up in the 70s and the 80s in a highly behaviorist, paradigm where it's like you read a book and then you do a test, the idea of authentic assessment becomes foreign and almost impalpable. So the challenge for me as a learning specialist and as a lead learning designer is to make this a concept that is achievable for that academic. And the way that I achieve that is that I ask them about what they actually do in their daily life. And in that conversation, we start identifying what's the project, what's the problem, what's the case study, what's the demonstration, what's the prediction or the collaboration that we can simplify into a task that can simulate what happens in the industry. And for example, if you're working in an ethical hacking unit, and through that conversation, the person realizes, oh wait, pen testing is something that I actually do on a daily basis, then probably the task will become, analyzing and actually writing a pen testing report. In a more simplified manner, of course. But that has been my experience, and it's something that I find quite fascinating.
Perfect. Thank you. I think one of the things you've also drawn there is the application of the assessments and actually relating to real life situation. Like most academics we've worked with, we know that struggle to make that connection for the student. Arjun, what's been your experience, and what makes for an authentic assessment in your current practice?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. So I really liked what you started with, which is sort of tying it to the skills and abilities required for professional life. And that makes a lot of sense to me. However, that's kind of only one segment of teaching and learning, right, of education, right? An important one, a critical one. But there's also foundational knowledge that, yes, someday you will use it in your career potentially, but it's so far removed from when you'll use it that it's a very different set of assessments you need, and it's more about how do I make sure that my students are prepared for their future coursework, which will build on top of this. And the assessments look very different. And then there's also just learning for learning's sake, which is also great, but assessment is a key part of learning, right? And so depending on sort of, which of these three buckets, which are not mutually exclusive by any means, you're thinking of, assessments could look very different. The other piece that people often go to when they talk about authentic assessment is the modality of the assessment. Is it a project? Is it a case study? Is it a presentation? Is it you doing something that looks like what you might do in professional life? And this varies greatly by the profession, right? If I'm going to be a web developer, I can give a student a project to go build a web application and assess it that way. If I'm going to be a doctor, yes, I will have some, real patient experience, but there's a huge library of assessments that lead up to my first patient encounter. And multiple choice is actually highly effective in medicine, because in medicine, you're trying to memorize all of these crazy complex things that you're going to see in your patients. And you need to very quickly be able to recognize what you're seeing in the real world and match it to what you learned in the past. You can do evidence-based medicine. But if you're going to a calculus course, multiple choice is now suddenly not a very good way of sort of getting that critical thinking out. And so, you have to really tailor the assessment to the goal. And that in the same course could mean you have some students with one goal and other students with another goal. And, we don't necessarily have the ability to personalize to that degree, but it's good to be aware of that. What's my audience in this course? 60% of people are trying to become doctors, 20% of people are just taking it for fun, et cetera, and really tailoring your assessment to meet those goals.
Perfect. Sorry, did you have more to add? Sorry,
I just had one last thing, which was, prior to my work at Gradescope, I was a computer science teaching assistant, and one thing that it might be surprising is in computer science, much of the work is still done on paper, right? It's a little ironic. Many of those assessments are actually highly authentic, though, because they get at the core critical thinking skills you're looking for. And so, again, it's just one of those ironic things that may come up. And it's not about the paper, but it's about the open-ended nature. It's not about running it on a computer. And so just one more example of where you really have to know what you're trying to do to kind of build the proper assessment.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Dr. Arif, have you got anything else to add to the conversation in terms of what makes for an authentic assessment?
Yeah, thanks, Jigdeep, for having me. Look, I see authentic assessment through the lens of education. And to me, education is like a vehicle. Education is a vehicle that can take you from your current location to your future dreamland. Now, that journey with education varies on many different variables, and authentic assessment is one of the top 3 most important variables for education in that journey in the modern era. No denial about that. So that's why I do believe that as an educator, we have to come to an understanding that authentic assessment is not just throwing some random case study to the students. The problem with their case studies are if people can't relate to that, the kids cannot relate to them. MBA school probably would be a bit different. When you give a case study from Google, Rio Tinto, Commonwealth Bank, wherever, these kids never work for these companies. They probably never work in an office setting. They can't relate to those case studies. They understand them, but they can't relate to them. But if we can do a bit of a tweak, which I did in one of the latest course for one of the reputed university in Australia for their artificial intelligence course, what I did, I asked them to work in a model that the United Nations working with using the data from Johns Hopkins University on COVID-19 data sets, and told them, let's go find some insight and let's save the world. All of a sudden, this AI, which is a tough course, became so very easy, and I found their engagement increased. But I realized there are 3 things happened there. One is that assessment was open-ended, it was relatable, and most importantly, they were in a mission. And I think, to me, that's what makes an assessment authentic.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for sharing on that. I think the next question for me is, we know what we know about authentic assessment, but we often see that when we work with different institutions, I'm just talking about myself as a learning designer, is there are challenges with actually changing the mindset of the academic, that's one, or the educators, and also giving them practical examples of how this has worked. So my next question goes to Kevin and Arif, because you're both educators. What would you say are the main challenges in the design of an authentic assessment? We'll go with Arif first this time.
Okay, sure. Look, there are some very common challenges, like it's hard to design, it's hard to evaluate, so on and so forth. Our juniors here, probably their Gradescope would help us mark the open-ended question very soon. But I think two practical challenges that I faced recently, one of them, as Liz kind of like mentioned, that finding the right people with the right skill set to design that authentic assessment. I do believe that you need to find those right people who have equal footings both in industry as well as in academia. And that goes for each and every discipline. So finding those individuals, it's a tough challenge, but there are other work around where you can have lots of workshops between industry and academia, but I think that's a long process. But I think finding the right people is still a challenge. But the second challenge that I would like to mention, it's about the traditional rubric that we are still using. In one hand, we are talking about authentic assessment, and on the other hand, we are talking about rubric, which kind of like often they don't make sense. I mean, for example, you ask kids to write a report and you say, for HD, it has to be an excellent quality. For D, it has to be advanced quality. For C, solid. B, good. What does that even mean? Solid, good, advanced, they don't even mean anything. And most importantly, the students never read them. And it becomes like your PhD thesis that you and your supervisor read your PhD thesis end to end. No one else in the world will ever read your PhD thesis. They will read only those bits and pieces that they need. So I think that is a big challenge. It's not working. And that's why my future prediction in maybe, I hate to put a year to it, but my future prediction is in 5 to 10 years, there will be a big change on this rubric. This is becoming useless a little bit, and with authentic assessment taking over, I think that will vanish.
Perfect. Kevin?
Look, building on what some of the points that Arif made, Arif suggested, look, it's challenging to find the right people. I came from an industry background into academia, so networking and forming relationships in industry was something that I was already conversant with, and I found that a lot of academics, because that's not the background they come from, they take a lens from an academic perspective. They don't necessarily see how the realization of their theory, their interest, their learning and teaching in a commercial context. So after I initially brought in some industry partners, that was deemed to be great for the school, particularly being an MBA program. But the conversation extended broader than that. And we found I was at a presentation, the Vice Chancellor said he was in Canberra talking to some very senior people in industry and asking the question, how do you rank our university in terms of doing business with us and coming and doing projects? And the feedback initially was it's just too hard because there's too many individuals we're dealing with. There's no centralisation. And I think at the time the thinking was that Melbourne Uni had it nailed in that sense, that there was a central point. So at RMIT, what we've developed is we've developed that people resource, and we've got about 10 full-time agents within a department of agents who engage with commercial, engage with the colleges and the schools around the sorts of projects that we're interested in working with, both for learning and teaching, and also with research interest as well. And that has proven a fantastic avenue, because otherwise, although I'm capable of getting projects and mining our alumni and what have you, which is again another underutilized things in many universities, we're doing this constructively now. And so I don't need to actually go out there and find everyone. I'm still choosing ones according to my research interests and what have you, and playing the game that all of us academics have to, which is we've got more pressure than ever before to be extraordinary teachers, extraordinary researchers, extraordinary industry engagers, and we can't do it all ourselves. And I think that's what Arif was alluding to. So we're getting systems and processes in place, and it's leading to much better outcomes for the school. On the planning side, I think that's challenging when you set these things up. Again, at the moment, the most recent project that we're working on this semester, it's almost like having a personal assistant. I've got folk from that team who are doing all of the liaising, organising the webinar to set up where I connect with them and get the resources I need, organising the schedule with them. And it's just made it so much more doable. And it makes it doable for academics who don't have that experience at the networking and building relationships. On the rubric side, I think the challenge with rubrics is taking feedback from students in terms of what's useful in a rubric and what's not. So when we have very broad motherhood statements like, you know, critical thinking and analysis and what does that mean for a student? So I've become much more literal and overt in what needs to be contained in a section of a rubric that might have that criteria showcasing in the distinctiveness between what's an HD and what gets down to a pass. And the students have found that that is far more informative. I think, you know, what Arif pointed out, they're being guided towards rubrics. It's something they can hang their hat off, but at the same time, if it's vague, it's not particularly helpful. I think in terms of the challenges, again, I come back to that sense of we are academics, we're trying to forge our own careers, we're trying to do well in our careers, and we're trying to juggle lots of responsibilities. I think whether you're in something very pragmatic and practical, like my courses in human-centered design and marketing are very pragmatic, but even if I wasn't, if I was in a discipline that was much more, I'd say, theoretical or whatever, I'd like to see if I could align that to an industry problem. And back to Arif's point, I've heard students say, MBA students, executive MBA students, if I hear another project around a big company like Google or whatever that I'll never work for, I have no interest. So I think we got caught up in textbooks that promoted, you know, often American produced textbooks that produced exemplars from the biggest end of town that nobody's ever going to work for. So what they love are projects that are real and meaningful that they can contribute to. And I just got off a session this morning with an industry partner where the students' marketing pitches informed a marketing plan that was pitched to a steering committee, which has now been approved for the next 6 months. So I'll go back this week to my students from semester 1 and say, you know, they said that they were going to do that. It's just happened today, and they're going to produce a video about what's come out of this particular project. Now, they can hang their hat off that. And on LinkedIn today, a student posted that, you know, their qualification, you know, their certificate of completion. And, you know, I made a comment, and then the comment back was that working on the it was the AFL Women's Project was a highlight of their qualification. So, you know, cited the particular project. It was very much at a relatable, it was all about female empowerment, that anyone with a daughter or a sister or a wife or a mother could relate to, you know. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think you raised some really good points there, Arif.
Yeah. All right, thanks both. Just to summarize there, what I'm hearing key challenges is finding the right people, and just leaning into what Kevin says is potentially, and don't quote me, is potentially hiring people into academia who have some form of industry background or are happy to collaborate with industry practices, and also looking at how we enhance rubrics so that they inform students' learning as opposed to telling them or penalize them for stuff they don't even know about. Like borrowing Arif's word, they're vague. Most rubrics are vague, and we need to start rethinking how we redesign rubrics. And now we're going to move to think about technology and think about how technology plays a part in enabling or enhancing authentic assessments. So my next question is to Liz and Arjun, because you guys are in the forefront of technology. Liz's background is in supporting academics with getting friendly with technology, like the way we put it. And Arjun knows everything about AI, or knows or supports the development of products that would enhance assessments. So the question goes to both of you, and it goes, to what extent is technology involved in guiding assessment design and the strategy? For this, we're going to start with Arjun. I just want to get a sense of how you think about technology, especially with this current climate of moving to remote learning, and how that has informed how people are beginning to think about assessment design.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. Even before COVID, technology influenced assessment design more often than assessment design influencing technology. And it's backwards. And with COVID, it gets exacerbated to a whole nother degree, right? And so instructors everywhere across the world are trying to figure out how they use their existing tools, often learning management system, deliver assessments that those systems were never built for. And the unfortunate reality is those tools are often prescriptive, and it leads to using things like multiple choice or short answer when it's just simply not appropriate. And so, one of the ways I think about our goal with Gradescope is try to get out of the way. Like, you're trying to deliver an assessment, trying to make it so you deliver whatever it is you want to deliver. There's tools there for you to use the right tool for the job. And that's kind of, in some ways, an impossible goal, but it's a good sort of mission to try to get to, of very much letting the assessment drive the technology rather than the other way around. And one way to think about this is, as you're building your assessment, whether it's because of COVID or previously, do you find yourself wishing that this was an analog experience instead? Why are you thinking that? And one of my favorite examples for this is actually working with a music theory instructor a few months ago. And the authentic assessment for music is typically quite clear. It's creating music or playing music. But this was a music theory course. And so she was used to handing out worksheets to her students, and they would write time signatures and the numbers and the notes and kind of write it out, and they'd give feedback. And then COVID hit, and she's like, I have no idea. Like, I want my students to draw notes. I don't want them to pick multiple choice, series of music. And she has no clue how to deliver this assessment through the tool she has anymore. And so she's flipping the assessment on its head, and they're no longer creating, they're recognizing. And in music, that's a pretty important distinction. And so, I think the reality is that the current situation is going to make technology catch up to where assessment needs to be very quickly, and I'm excited to see that happen. But the reality is technology influences assessment much more than we wish it would.
Yeah. All right. So now, Liz, with your experience working with academics on a day-to-day basis, trying to get them to rethink how they design courses, and with your background in supporting academics and adopting technology, how would you describe the extent, or to what extent is technology involved in guiding assessment design, and how do you manage that conversation with academics as well?
So, oh my gosh, I think Arjun, nailed it on the head right there with how often, the academics come to me and they're like, oh, here's this amazing virtual machine. Let's use this virtual machine. I want to use this virtual machine. You're like, great. What's the purpose? What do you want students to achieve with it? So to answer your question, I don't think technology actually should guide assessment design. I think Arjun is right. It has to be the design of assessment. So using technology has to have a pedagogical reason behind it. You have to have, it is best for you to have a pedagogical sequence already planned out before you actually even think about selecting and using technology. And that's a conversation to have with some academics. And it's actually useful with other academics who may be reluctant to actually use technology in their classes. So usually in my own practice, I sit down with academics. Often some of the younger ones are really open to technology. There are some other ones that are not as open to technology because they're nervous about it and they don't know how to use it and it's too complicated. So I actually start from, all right, what do we want to achieve here? What's the objective? And then we start asking, people love talking about themselves. So I usually ask them about, well, what do you do in your actual practice in the field when you had an experience to work in the field? And then they love talking about themselves. And, in there you start picking up, oh yeah, whoa, that's a good idea for a project. That's a good idea for a problem to present. That's a good idea for a collaboration right there. How about we actually start brainstorming how to make this into a task that is aligned to the objective we've already identified. And then we start thinking about what are the tasks that would actually support this assessment and that is actually aligned to the objectives. And so the academics are all thinking about this pedagogical sequence without understanding, oh yeah, this is about pedagogy here. And at the end, once we have all of that sequence sort of planned out, what we actually do, I get them to do is like, all right, how can we enhance this and facilitate not only the physical, emotional, but most importantly, the cognitive engagement of students with this task? And that's where technology can come in and facilitate that if we're smart about it. But that is at the end, once we have the whole sequence ready. So for example, with the person that had the virtual machine going, what ended up happening is that, we decided that it was a network security unit. So we decided that, part of the job that this person had in the industry was to analyze networks and then to actually identify potential threats. And at the end, they would actually reconfigure that network so that it was a more secure set up for the company. So once we had that idea, then we started thinking, oh, okay, so how can we actually use your virtual machine to facilitate this? And that made him think, oh yeah, I can create this digital print of a network for students to come in and analyze. And he went off with it, but he already had a pedagogical reason for it. Also, when you actually do this sequence in your conversations with academics, the ones that are reluctant to use technology, once they're excited about their idea, once they know exactly where they're going, it's easier for you to say, how about we actually use something like, a collaboration tool? Can we actually get students to, use things like any kind of technology that you have available, maybe like a virtual whiteboard, if you can, just giving examples. And they're often more open to the idea because they already know how they're going to be using that in their task.
Awesome. I think just to summarize that, I think one of the key points there is we should think pedagogy before technology. I think most times working with academics, they're like, we've got all these amazing tools. I just want to use a new tool. But the question is, what's the pedagogical underpinning there? Why do you want to use this? Where's the learning for the student? So thanks for bringing that up again. So we're going to take a different direction now. We're going to look at how the perception for students on assessment, how we can utilize that to inform learning for the student. And this question goes for Arif. I've just been told we have about 25 minutes to go, so we're gonna have to just keep our answers short, sharp, and to the point, and hopefully we can take one or two questions from the audience as well. Arif, so the question is, how are students' perceptions of assessment being utilized to inform its design and future uplifts?
Yeah, thanks. Look, for this particular perception, I think the most important thing here is not the integration part, that you get the perception and then integrate that. But I think how do you get that perception is the key thing. Me being the data person, like student survey is one of the most popular way of getting student perception. But my advice would be, don't just add as you see the survey, dig into it, because one of the trends that I have been seeing over and over, that those students with poor academic grades tends to give negative feedback. So be very careful on when you're trying to add the student perception to your authentic assessment design. The other thing, which is something that I have been working most recently, is to be able to integrate some informal and indirect conversation that you can have with the students and get those conversations integrated into your assessment design. Doesn't matter how much you put online description of those assessments, students will definitely going to talk to the lecturer at the end of the class. That's your informal conversation. In the lift, they will follow you to your room. That's an informal conversation. Try to use those information. But indirect information sometimes. So this is what I test when I go to the classroom, and I tell them, guys, predict the future of information management in 5, 10, 20 years. The best example I find from students, given that I use the word information, they always give me an example, something to do with Google. Google and information somehow goes hand in hand in their mind. But when I tell them, guys, think about it, searching something on Google is such a slow process. You have to open your device, you have to give a command, the search comes, you pick the link, you find the information, super slow. How about I say, in the future, you're not going to search the information will search you. And I do believe personally that's going to happen, and that's already happening. And immediately things changes, conversation changes, and that's where I get a lot of indirect conversation. Listen to your students, get them talking, challenge their ideas, and that's where you get tons of information, perception to add into your assessment.
Perfect. I just want to share something I've also, just to contribute to that response, is the idea of persona mapping, which is one of the key things I'm sure Kevin and Liz have done during the course design. Anybody who's doing course design is we look at who are the personas of the students coming in. And it's one of the core part of learning design is actually understanding who we're designing for. And that in that context, we're able to understand how to design an assessment that meets the needs for that persona. Another thing I would like to share is the need for iteration, because we're living in a world of constant evolution. Technology is changing, and it's being open to the fact that this year this assessment worked. Next year we have to rethink it. But we get to the point where we get very comfortable in doing the same assessment year after year after year, and that means we're still achieving the same results. And next thing, it's not until we get a survey result that's saying that this is a really terrible assessment, then we flip it. So I'm just to add to that. Now, just on those lines, I would like Arjun to share with us his recommendations for key elements that make for successful delivery of an authentic assessment. It could be technology, it could be how you map out the assessment, it could be whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, so I'll just really quickly start. A lot of the most important stuff has already been said. What are the objectives? What are the personas? You have to start from there, obviously. And then I always go to, do I wish, as I build my assessment, do I wish I were doing something else, and why? Is it because I had a previous assessment that was highly successful, that my students found entertaining or enjoyable, that was engaging? I really like what Arif said earlier around the assessment gives them a mission, right? Will the students find this rewarding? Will it be one of the 5 or 10 assessments that they remember 10 years later? Right? I still have assessments that I remember, like those are the most fun projects I had. Like 10 years later, I still remember those hours I spent on it. It's not practical for every assessment to take that form, but that should be in your mind because it, as you put it best, it gives them a mission. And how much more rewarding would this whole experience be if on every single assessment you have, you feel like you're kind of driving towards a particular mission? The other key thing is, does this assessment allow me to give my students the feedback that I would want to give? Right? It kind of goes to the rubric comment. Am I crafting something that helps them not just do the work, but also helps them kind of understand where they're succeeding and where they want to go improve? And so often we kind of go to the standard forms of the rubric must look like this. And just as you said, it's just you're checking the boxes, you're filling the blanks. And it's not actually giving the students the rich feedback that they deserve and that you want to give them. And the last piece that I want to talk about is, how do you ensure this authenticity without sort of putting undue pressure on the students? And that could come in multiple ways. It could be the task is too big for the time you're giving them, or it could come to, I want to invigilate everything, I'm going to pass it through every potential integrity checker out in the world, and it kind of puts this huge stress on this assessment, and it kind of takes away the ability for the student to engage with the work. So again, you have to choose the right tool for the job, starting with what's the goal, what's the audience, what tools are available, and then fit the assessment to the job.
All right, thanks for sharing that. Now the final question is going to go to 2 of our panelists, and hopefully we can grab a question or 2 from the audience. Now the question goes to Arif and Kevin and Liz. Sorry, and it's. Now we're looking at how we can measure success. Let's say we've trialed this amazing authentic assessment. Now, how do we think about measuring the success of that authentic assessment? And the question is, how can educators measure the success of an assessment design, and what role does the student feedback, if it does, play in this process? Liz, I'll let you go first, and we'll end up with Kevin.
Depending on who is measuring the success and what for. So measure how much learning and how successful the assessment was in terms of learning, then one of the things that I would ask is, can your students communicate the outcome of that assessment? And this may change based on the teaching strategy of each institution, but I do work with a specific partner, and I was talking to the head of teaching and learning in this specific school, and one of the things that he is really concerned about is that every time he goes into industry and talks to industry says, well, look, what we need is students that can communicate. So as a result of that, one of the strategies is that we need to make sure that in every unit of this program, the students are communicating, know how to communicate clearly, confidently, and concisely. So as part of the assessment strategy, and in order to see the success of these from a learning perspective, we actually include both a video presentation as a part of the final component in the final assessment to ensure that students are able to communicate that and practice those soft skills students who have a role there, especially because students actually let you know that if your assessment, just like Arjun was saying, is your assessment functional? Is your assessment clear? Is your assessment in depth and achievable? But if you're measuring success from an institutional perspective, something that aches a lot to me, particularly in my own experience, is that most institutions focus on the student experience service as a way to measure success. And that's a very limited view. Something that I would recommend, for example, are the 5 points of verification instead, to do a more complete assessment of the success of your units. Take into account the student's experience service. Yes, that says something, but also the facilitator feedback, the student feedback, the element statistics. How about you take into account some of the grades and dropout rates, because that might say something about the unit that you just created. So yeah, it depends who's looking at it, but I say can communicate it would be the best measure of learning.
Excellent. Kevin?
Yeah, look, I'm the program manager of our online MBA and a couple of grad certs that we launched last year. And we were one of the early schools to sort of get involved. And so this whole thing about measurement and improving experience is something that we went through with some early sort of learnings on the low side, and then we've built up to a high standard now, which is consistently high. So we've certainly recognized from the student perspective, and this was really part of, we're fortunate at RMIT, we've got RMIT Online as a very well-resourced online creator who partner with third parties likes of KeyPath and others. So I've worked with Liz in the past and her team. It's about getting the systems and processes right. And then if you're using online delivery, you've got a lot of monitors in terms of the level of engagement, when they were last on, what they're actually engaging with in terms of activities and tasks that you design throughout. So I think there's that aspect. The other aspect are things that Liz pointed out that we probably all do to a degree anyway, which are things like, maybe formalizing a pulse sort of check on what you're doing and invite students to provide some feedback on what's working for them and what isn't. And we found that quite effective to do early and around the midpoint. Just a reflection on the nature of questions that students are asking to, get a perception through that feedback loop of whether there's clarity, whether they're sufficiently challenged. So as I think Arjun alluded to, you want them to be intellectually stimulated, but you don't want them to be confused because they're busy people and people who are choosing to study online, or at the moment, everyone's online. Certainly, for us here in good old Victoria. That's the reality. And the learnings we've had around ensuring we're highly organized based on those learnings, and that learning data was captured by RMIT Online and fed back to each of the schools that have programs online, which is everyone now. So we now have set standards for online delivery, and it's really good. If you do things like you feed forward the expectations for the week, you set out what the tasks for the tutorial are, you set activities in those tasks and have people in things like breakout groups and things where they get peer-to-peer as not just listening to your voice, who they probably get on the pre-recorded webinar sort of lecture. They don't want to turn up to a tute and just listen to you again. And I've heard anecdotally from students who are not at my institute, they find that rather boring. But the feedback that we're getting by experimenting with, technology that enables engagement. I use Padlet, for example. In the second week, we're doing a topic on research. So I got them to do an existential research piece where they basically give a bit of a deep story of what brought them back to postgrad study. But it's also a good way for them to get to know each other before they formulate groups. So that's part of what is the purpose, as you mentioned previously. What was the design around using the tool? Not just people did that and it's like, wow, that doesn't contribute to anything. You actually signal what it's doing and why it's important and how that will help them to form a group that they feel comfortable working with for whatever reason. And there's other, introductory things. Share your LinkedIn. We had a webinar where everyone did an intro and talked about what they could bring in terms of soft and hard skills to group work. That's an interesting way for them to sort of share up front. And then there's tools around managing that. We're working with Spark Plus. I've got executive MBA students. It's like having 40 leaders in a class. So I'm not using it in a punitive way, which it's probably designed to be a little bit like peer review, says, to help moderation, but I'm using it to provide constructive feedback, which feeds into their final assessment, which is, what should I really work on if I'm going to be a better leader? And some of the students have opened up and said, the reason I didn't get that promotion, I was told I'm actually not a great listener. It's the cultural aspect that needed to be improved upon. And so that was really great feedback then to get in that third assessment piece where they do a reflection of who they are, what's brought them. They do their own SWOT and TOES analysis of themselves, and then they, from that, design a program. And we've had really good feedback on how that's transformed their life going forward. But again, that links to why have some of those activities, feed it through, and then they get to see, yeah, it did actually feed through. It was worth my while doing that. And Liz would speak to that. That's the whole pedagogy around, learning design in the online world. And I'm a convert because I went there with my colleagues of academia. Chooks will remember those days.
I remember those days very well, Kevin.
We're very polite to each other, aren't we, Chooks? We went through the highs and the lows, and we got through with great outcome, But I think that was converting academics to realise that doing activities is not spoon feeding. When it's designed properly around pedagogy, you can fuse theory and practice and practical in ways that work. Just telling students to go away and read stuff and then rock up and answer questions is not what they're really interested in doing all the time.
Yeah, I agree. So we've got barely about 10 minutes, I think. So I'm just going to take one question from the audience, and I've been looking through the many questions. One that's hit the nail on the head, or something that I think we'll find interesting, is what impact, and this is from Phyllis, what impact do you think COVID and online or blended learning will have on assessment? Is it harder to moderate? I will throw this question to Arjun, and we'll hear Ari's response to that as well.
Yes, so it will definitely be harder to moderate, and it all comes down to we're not with the students, and we cannot have as much control over what technology is available to the student. So we have to kind of be more inclusive as well, right? So those two things on its own, just by definition, make it much more difficult. If you're at an institution that's able to control the technology environment of the student by providing a certain type of device and all that, it changes a little bit, but that's quite difficult. And so it comes down to, how can our assessments be a little more robust such that they can accept input regardless of where my students are and what technology they have available to them, right? The other piece of it is really the integrity piece, right? Like, yes, there's going to be some high stakes examinations where perhaps the invigilation is highly critical, but it's problematic to potentially bring it into every single assessment. So what are some ways we can get that comfort that the student did the task themselves, and that they did the task themselves, but then they also really did the thinking? And so one of my favorite things that I've seen some instructors do is they have their students record a 2-3 minute video of them talking through the work they did, and just submit a short video along with their assessment. And so yes, you go and mark all the work, and then you watch the video, and like if the student has demonstrated that they've done the thinking, you feel good about it. And every so often you'll find that one student where it's clear that they found somebody, whether it's on the internet or their friend or whoever, to do it for them, and then you go and talk to them and figure out what's going on. And then there's a moderation of the marking as well, which is a whole other set of challenges. And so the remote piece here is actually potentially helpful, in my view, right? Because it's much easier to do these things with consistency when you're using technology on the marking side. You can add quality controls and all those things that just get much more difficult in person. So the delivery, I think, is more challenging. The after the fact quality controls, I think, actually get a little easier.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's yeah, I agree that it's going to be really challenging to moderate, and you need to think about the integrity when it comes to assessments. Arif, have you got anything else to add to that question before
I mean, I agree everything that Arjun said, but at the same time, probably if Arjun said that it would sound like more like a marketing, I would say on his behalf that his product is one of the good products that are out there. I recommend everyone to take a look at that. But one of the things, to take his last point on marking, for example, one of the things that we have to be able to do slowly to have open-ended questions. But how do you mark those open-ended questions? It creates a lot of work on the lecturers who is marking. But tools like this, if you're asking me 5 years ago, I would say not possible. But with AI, natural language processing stuff, it is possible. I mean, I'm very sure Arjun and his team is working, but hopefully we get more tools like that.
All right, perfect. So we've got barely 5 minutes to go. So I'm just going to do a quick summary. And this is my summary of my understanding of what's been said. I think when we think about authentic assessment is, first of all, thinking about relating the students' assessments to what they're going to do in industry. That's one key element. Understanding the pedagogy before designing or picking the technology, and thinking about how we redesign rubrics, how we redesign tasks, and also looking to engage industry is one of the my key takeaways from this session. I'm sure everyone here has got so many other key takeaways, and just because of time, we can't continue talking. So thank you all thanks to my panelists, first of all, for coming on this talk today. Your wealth of knowledge has been very inspiring. I believe people have at least opened their minds to the fact that authentic assessment is where we're going with current institutional experiences. And hopefully we can start thinking about how we not only understand the best practices, but share these best practices so that people can do better work in terms of educating our learners. I want to also thank Times Higher Ed for providing us this opportunity for us to have this conversation, especially in these COVID times. I want to formally thank everyone who's worked in the background to make this a huge success. And before we end up, I want to invite everyone to go visit the booths in the exhibition hall. There's so many things you can see, the things you can contribute. You can also come and join us at the Turnitin booth and ask more questions. I will take all the questions that we were not able to answer, and hopefully we can respond to them. If you're willing to share with us your LinkedIn profile or whatever contacts you have, we can send them to you so that way we can keep the conversation going. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Chikade. That was great.